there's definitely one thing that should definitely be improved upon for the upcoming remake of the original School Reflection, it should be the animation. Way back from when I was making the original School Reflection film, I had little idea as to how exactly to achieve 2D animation. The visuals to the story were mainly achieved by me hand sketching the pictures on paper, with the final results looking fairly crude. But since the original, I've acquired so many tools to help aid on creating 2D animation. And while it's nowhere near being professional, it's still increasingly better than what I did them years ago. Now I'll show the process on how I create my own 2D animation. I'll be showing the process by showing off my recent 5-minute test reel of the original School Reflection film. What I did for this process was sketch over many of the original drawings from the first film, using an app from the Mac called Graphic. It's pretty similar to Photoshop, with the added layers. After sketching over the original picture, then colouring in the picture, I convert it into a PNG file. A PNG file is basically where you have no background behind the actual image, so I can apply whatever background I may wish. After creating my images, I drag them over to my editing software. I use Final Cut Pro. The intended scene of what I want to animate with these images is where the character is shocked, so I want the character to do a slight jump. So how we would go about animating this jumping motion, after importing the images, then what I would do, I would then begin to keyframe the images. By selecting the box that changes the whole size of the image, you'll see a little tab. If you click this should add in the first keyframe. Then if we go across the timeline for a couple of seconds, or a couple of frames, depending on the scene, I would then pose the images to where I'd want it to be. If I wanted the character to do a pause between the movements, I would then move forward a little bit in the timeline, depending on how long I want the pause to be. In this scene, I want the character to jump up, and swap out the picture to appear like the character is moving slightly. So swapping out the images in roughly the same pose, then slightly moving the picture downwards to add in a bit of anticipation for the jump scene. In order to give the jump a bit more of a springy action, what I will do with this image, I'll squash it down slightly, then when we cut to the next image of when the character's jumping upwards, we'll stretch out the picture. But it's vital for these squash and stretch sequences that they only last for a matter of frames. I would perhaps give it about 2 or 3 frames. And I want to make sure that the highest point that I want my character to jump up to will only last 1 or 2 frames. Then I'll have the character returning to the original pose he was in, but making that movement last for about 3 or 4 frames. And after doing this, you got yourself a nice bit of jumping animation. As a bit of an experiment, I wanted to see if I could save doing more drawings by having this jumping motion between the drawings. I did add in one original drawing between the jumping frames, just as an attempt to add in a slight bit of smooth movement between the action frames, but I do contemplate if this is overly necessary, as since that they only last for a matter of frames, it's not like people are going to really notice or see it. I've also added on 2 separate drawn objects on towards each other, such as this bouncing head. The reason that I've done this is because I don't want the actual character to just be one giant stiff object, to actually give some element of the body parts some weight to them. Animating this component, it took me about roughly a week to do about 5 minutes. But after doing this test footage, I was rather unsatisfied with the character designs, as there was an inconsistency with the sketches between the drawings, as 2 drawings would never look rather similar or identical, such as the eyes changing sizes, the number of lumps for the hair, and the size of the nose and the stomach. Reflecting on these small little inconsistencies with the drawings, I decided that I'd ought to go back and redo the character designs, but to make the design much more refined. Take for example the very first designs of The Simpsons, and then how they look in the main TV series. They look far less messy than their original counterparts. Take Bart and Lisa's hair. In the original, there's a countless number of spikes they have on their hair, and they're not really straightened out, they're a bit more floppy. But then in the main series, there's a much more limited amount of spikes that they have on their hair, a countable amount that you can see, and much more straightened out than they originally were. This was probably done because every time that the animation had to be done with The Simpsons, they had to redraw that hair. So by redesigning it, making it less messy, and creating a certain shape and style for each Simpsons hairstyle, It not only made it much more easier for the animators to keep continuity between the scenes with the Simpsons, but it also made something far more pleasing to the eye. So I decided to go back and refine the designs of my original School Reflection characters. For the small autistic lad, I decided to only give a certain limited amount of lumps for his hairstyle. For his fringe at the top of his head, I made it into the style of an 8, and then added 3 lumps either side to it. To make up the rest of his hair, I also decided to make his eyes and nose a very particular and certain shape. After doing this, I created a model sheet for the characters. A model sheet being a design of the finalized character that you're going to animate, and having it at the side of you while you're working and animating the character, it helps you that you can constantly look back to it as a reference to make sure what you're drawing is still exactly how the character would be sketched out. The teacher character, Mrs. Sugar, who was somewhat the villain of the original film, I had already partially redesigned her when I was doing my test animation. What I did in her redesign was that I wanted to make her seem far more villainous. As far back when I made my original School Reflection film, a slight bit of criticism I had with the design of Mrs. Sugar was that she wasn't villainous enough. In order to make her seem far more intimidating, I decided to give her somewhat of a seductive body, such as for example, Lady Horror Hostess that you get. And to make the hair slightly more messier, to make her seem a bit more, well, nasty. I tried to redefine her look, just like I did with the autistic lad's look, making her seem far more evil, giving her a squarer face. I tried giving her horns in the style of her hair, but I felt like it was starting to get a bit too much. I went on further redesigning the design, and well, I just kind of think over time she looked more like an alien, so I reflected back more on how I did her in my test design, just revising the hairstyle a bit.